Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to another episode of the Versus Stars podcast, third season. How, my loyal listeners, thank you for your continued support. And remember, like and subscribe. It's an amazing episode because David Mack boards the mothership to discuss his new novel, Star Trek Firewall. Now come on board as we go traversing the stars. Hi, Mr. Mack. Thank you so much for coming to the Versus Stars podcast.
Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
So it's my honor to have you on the show. I love your books. So for people who know you or don't know you, you're a very prolific writer of Star Trek novels. You've written a lot. So what keeps you coming back to the universe?
They keep paying me.
That's a good answer.
Beyond that, obviously, as I've said on many interviews across the years, I just love Star Trek. It's my first fandom love. It's what I grew up with. It's what I imprinted on as a child. I grew up watching the syndicated reruns as a kid in the 70s. And it's also where I began my writing career on television back in the mid 90s with Star Trek Deep Space Nine. So the fact that partly I owe my career to Star Trek, and just the fact that this universe, this vision of a shared future that I have loved my whole life, the fact that I get to contribute to it, to its legacy, both in the canon, having written for TV, and then also in its extended universe, writing for its various types of tie-ins. It feels like a great honor and a great privilege to be part of that legacy. To love something this much and then also be able to contribute to it, it's a very rare thing, and I feel very lucky.
As someone who does get to contribute to Star Trek novels, it either allows or forces, depending on your perspective, to deep dive into the universe, probably further than even some of the fans do, who are obviously very hardcore. So, as you've been writing these novels and developing them, what has it allowed you to understand better about the universe being that deep in as a part of it?
I think when you take really deep dives into, say, something like the Star Trek universe, my fellow authors and I think, were able to perceive a little bit earlier than, say, some of our cohort, some of the flaws in the vision of the future, some of the hidden weaknesses, the areas where the Federation fails to live up to its own ideology, to its own ideals, where it talks the talk, but it doesn't always walk the walk. There's a hypocrisy sometimes in the actions of the Federation. And the writers of the show and the movies are sometimes aware of it, and they've managed to address it. And I think in a way that's fair. I think that it's one thing to say humanity strives for utopia, and I think it was a little unrealistic, let's say back in the '60s, to assume that we were actually going to achieve
Mm.
utopia. I think that was maybe we were giving ourselves a little too much credit there. I think that by the time we got through the end of Next Generation and into Deep Space Nine, the writers of the show and those who were writing the tie-ins began to perceive that humanity might strive for paradise, but it was always going to be a bit short. There were always going to be threats to paradise. Paradise is something that's very fragile. It's something that can be lost very easily if you take your eye off the ball, if you succumb to fear, if you succumb to prejudice, if you make decisions, based on bad information.
Mm.
Um, it's very easy to lose the paradise you've built. And a paradise for one group of people maybe is not a paradise for others. Maybe not everybody wants to live in the same kind of paradise.
Mm.
Maybe what I consider paradise, somebody else thinks of as dystopia. So I think the people writing Star Trek behind the scenes, and then the tie-in novelists also, again, we began to key into that a little earlier, I think, than, say, some of the general fandom. There were always going to be members of the fandom who are ahead of the curve and saw this way ahead of when we
Mm.
did. But it's all part of a curve. And I think that, if anything, it's one of those things where once you begin to realize where these weak spots are in the philosophy, you then say, well, then how do we shore them up? How do you address them? How do you fix them? And if they're not reparable, how do you at least compensate for them? What is a way to address this that lives up to the spirit of what the Federation wants to be, even if in reality it can't always get there.
No, I really like what you said, and your book seems to explore it a bit as well. Because we talk about external threats, you got the Borg, Dominion, Klingon, but from what you're saying, and a little bit of, and as well, what the book is discussed, we're about to read Firewall. The greatest threat, it sounds like, to Starfleet and the Federation of Planets is us. Would that be correct?
Yeah, yeah, I think that sounds about right. I mean, what they're dealing with in Firewall is, or at least what Seven is dealing with, is the fact that there is fear and prejudice within Federation society, especially on Earth, because the people of Earth have just, I say, around 2373, about 5 years before Voyager comes home, the Borg walked right up to Earth and knocked. They were that close to just taking Earth off the map. So they're a little bit edgy when it comes to dealing with the Borg. Anything related to the Borg has these people, freaking out.
Hmm.
So when she comes home with Voyager, she's one of the first emancipated Borg drones of long time assimilation that they've ever encountered. They have no reason to trust her, every reason to fear her. And there's no way that Janeway or Seven could have known while they were in the Delta Quadrant that these events had transpired on Earth. There's
Hmm.
no way they could have known that. There's no way Janeway could have known that the Earth she was taking Seven back to was going to be one that had been freshly traumatized by the Borg and
Hmm.
was going to be so openly hostile to her. And that Starfleet and the Federation government, by extension, also were going to be hostile to her and would not welcome her the way she was promised. So, and again, you would think that an enlightened society, as such as the Federation claims to be, would be beyond these things. But we've seen very clearly in the shows, particularly the more recent
Hmm.
incarnations of Star Trek, that this is not the case, that it is still possible to scare the population into reactionary beliefs, into reactionary politics. We saw this in Picard,
Hmm.
where the events on Mars with the supposed synth attack, nobody really cares to get to the bottom of who actually caused the synths to do what they did. They simply take this event at face value and use it as a reactionary basis to outlaw artificial intelligence, to outlaw androids, sentient androids. Well, there's no good reason for that. There's no reason to think that that was the actual cause for the disaster. But people fear what they don't understand. They fear what's new. They fear what's different. And so we see in Picard that even at that point, people are willing to freak out about something and shut out a whole class of people. So Seven is simply, at this earlier stage in the continuity, getting her own taste of that. She's on the receiving end of it before the sentient androids were. So yeah, I mean, I think that that's really what the Federation is dealing with, is that its biggest problem sometimes is its own people.
Now, and I think what's kind of interesting about that as well is that um, the novel Firewall is going to explore the racism that Seven has to deal with as being part of the Borg. And if the new Trek had not come out and all you saw was come up from Next Generation, for the most part, Picard got away with it as having been a former Borg, and people seem to have kind of got past until you get to Picard, and you see no, and a little bit with Deep Space Nine with Cisco, that no, people were not so okay with what happened with Picard and the Locutus. And I think it's fantastic that you're exploring that as well with Seven and continuing that idea of that even in this perfect world, people are still going to be people and they're still going to feel that prejudice. And I think it's interesting that Seven is dealing with that as well. Do you think, once again, talking about the novel that comes after Voyager, did her former crew help her enough in coming back into society and backed her up enough, in your opinion, for her to avoid that kind of loneliness that she eventually feels?
I think that the issue that she has, it's not that they didn't do their best to socialize her and acclimate her to human society and Federation culture. It's just that there was only so much they could do. This is not their specialty. If you look at the environment that she was presented with on Voyager, it seemed to be very cis heteronormative. it's very limited. It was very narrow and sort of parochial in its approach to what values they were trying to impart to Seven, and saying, this is human culture, this is Federation culture, etc. So, as successful or unsuccessful as it might have been, the real issue is that when she comes home to Earth in 2378 with Voyager, the crew of Voyager disperses. And this is, according to the continuity of Star Trek Picard. This was also brought up in Star Trek Prodigy. They scatter, except for Janeway, who stays at Starfleet Command and is relatively accessible to Seven. Tuvok goes into some sort of classified position within Starfleet Command in the security apparatus. Tom and B'Elanna go off to have their kid. The Doctor's off on his speaking tour promoting holographic sentient rights. Harry Kim gets a new starship assignment. Basically, everybody's gone. Chakotay, according to Prodigy, soon after coming home, he gets promoted to captain and put in charge of the very highly classified Protostar project. This is a project where, because if you take into account that Seven has been denied a place in Starfleet, they won't give her a commission, they won't admit her to the academy, and by extension, the Federation government won't basically renew her citizenship because she won't accept, her old Federation name. She's not Annika Hansen. She's a Borg drone who goes by 7 of 9, identifying the Federation's greatest enemy at that time. She can't go anywhere near the Protostar project. So this relationship she would have had just sort of starting out with Chakotay by the end of the Voyager TV series immediately goes on the rocks because she can't follow him. He can't let her on the ship. He can't even say the name of the ship to her. He can't tell her anything. And Seven is only, so human at this point, but she does succumb to envy, resentment, anger, seeing everybody else move on, move up, move away, and especially Chakotay moving on to this very prestigious, top secret classified command, and being told she can't follow him, she can't go with him, he can't talk to her about it. That's going to poison their relationship. That's just hemlock for an intimate relationship when something like that happens. All of her anger and resentment about being shut out, and then on top of that, him being promoted after he was McKee. I mean, she's just not going to take well to that. So, despite all of their efforts at socialization, the really more pertinent issue is that shortly after coming back to this culture, which is hostile to her, she loses her whole found family. She loses the emotional support network that she had taken for granted. And that, is just one of those things where once it's gone, it's gone. And we brought up Picard, and although he does have some folks who have lingering resentments toward him and are willing to bring up the whole Wolf 359 incident, there's also a reason why Picard wasn't shut out of Starfleet and why it doesn't dog him so aggressively. First of all, he didn't come back with any visible Borg augmentation. 2, he was only assimilated for a matter of hours. Really. He was in there for less than a day and they pulled him back out. So you can almost look at it as a fluke. It was a minor blip. Yes, it was tragic, but his will was compromised. It's certainly not the first time that sort of thing has been documented in the Star Trek universe. So one can imagine, yes, some people who suffer direct consequences are going to continue to blame him, but others are going to let it go. Whereas Seven comes back with very visible augmentation and 18 plus years of assimilation within the Borg collective. That's a very different equation. And she's got, prominent ability to deploy Borg nanoprobes and do all kinds of crazy stuff with them. Documented from her time on Voyager, she can take over ship systems. She can raise the dead under the right conditions. She can do crazy things with these damn nanoprobes, and they give her all kinds of incredible abilities. Plus, she's got Borg tissue underneath her human tissue that we can't even see, that makes her super strong, super durable. She's got enhanced reflexes, enhanced senses, enhanced synaptic response. I mean, she's essentially superhuman and is told to hide it. So there's a lot of reasons why people are going to be a lot more afraid of Seven than they were of Picard.
Now, one interesting part about the story as well is that you do get a chance to have some interaction between Janeway and Seven. Their interactions do, while Janeway is supportive, there's a coldness, it feels like, between the two. Can you kind of dive that into a little bit of why, at least on Seven's side, why she might not be as warm and welcoming to Janeway as you would think, being that she's the former captain?
Well, the friction that exists at the beginning of the book, beginning of Firewall, between Janeway and Seven, is more Seven acting in a sort of emotional defense posture. What's happened at this point is the multiple rejections that Seven has taken from Starfleet and the Federation have occurred even as Janeway is stepping up and is threatening to resign her commission as an admiral, in order to show her solidarity with Seven. Now, partly Seven does not want her own sort of failures and all the grief she's taking to further impact Janeway. She cares about Janeway, and she doesn't want Janeway's career and reputation to be destroyed along with her own. At least that's part of what she's telling herself. But in reality, what's going on is that Seven, because of these very public repudiations, she is feeling humiliated. She's feeling angry. She's feeling persecuted. She's afraid. And she's perfectly justified in all this. But it is not her way to internalize feelings. And she doesn't have a lot of emotional experience at unpacking this sort of emotional baggage. And so she tends to externalize. She instead, because she can't unpack it and figure it out internally, she redirects it outward, and it comes out as a defense mechanism, a barrier, an unwillingness to engage or admit vulnerability, a tendency to push people away as a preemptive defensive move. And you see it also in her decision to leave. She tells Janeway that she's doing it for Janeway's good. In reality, she's doing it because she knows she can never build the life she wants to live on Earth. She can never be who she wants to be as long as she stays there. She says she's doing it for Janeway's benefit, but in truth, Seven is really doing it for herself. She's just not prepared to admit that yet. And then over the course of the book, the relationship between them is strained again when Seven, evinces this desire to sort of affiliate herself with the Fenris Rangers. And Janeway's big problem with this is she says, look, they used to be a legitimate organization, but the governments that gave them legitimacy have since collapsed or been replaced in coups or whatever because of the political instability caused by the burgeoning Romulan crisis. And as a result, the various political entities that gave this law enforcement agency any hint of legitimacy, they're gone. The agency continues on. It continues to try to perform its mission of interstellar patrols, protecting shipping, apprehending fugitives, rescuing people in trouble, et cetera, et cetera. But it no longer has any real legal foundation to show why it has the authority to do so. It's just sort of like zombie walking through what its mission was. And Janeway's problem is once you've taken away civilian governmental oversight, these are now really just vigilantes. They may have their own internal code and they may have courts and whatever, but Janeway doesn't trust them because they don't answer to anybody but themselves. And to her, that's a problem. It's the same problem that Cisco had with Section 31. An organization that doesn't answer to anybody is intrinsically illegitimate. It doesn't answer to the government. It has no oversight. And when it screws up, nobody can hold it to account because there is no oversight. It doesn't have any place in the government. It doesn't have any place in society. Seven doesn't see it that way. She sees a group of good people in a bad situation who are doing their best to protect the innocent, protect the weak, and are not bound by the kind of strict rules, regulations, bureaucratic red tape that Starfleet and the Federation labor under, often, causing them to move much more slowly, and often, with less efficacy. And she sees an advantage to the way the Fenris Rangers conduct their operations. At the same time, by the end of the book, she also has to concede Janeway was right. You skip ahead a few years to the end of the book, the framing sequence set a few years after the main events of the book. And Seven has to begrudgingly sort of admit, 5, 6 years down the road, Janeway was right. The wheels are coming off this thing. They are slowly becoming exactly what she said they were going to be, which is they're going to turn into a bunch of Robin Hood gangs who patrol their, particular sectors with no central command, no oversight, no control, no hierarchy. They may do some good, but with no oversight, they may also do some evil. They may be corruptible. And so you find that, Janeway, maybe was right about that particular aspect. But what's important about the Janeway Seven dynamic as you go through the book is it's really about, the classic coming of age tale, in that Seven is effectively a child who has to leave home. She has to cut the strings of authority that connect her to the surrogate parent figure, the surrogate mother of Janeway. And there's this struggle of ideology as they, the Janeway is saying, well, I don't think you're making very smart choices. And the adult daughter basically has to say, well, they're my choices to make. And the arc that takes them through the end of the story is when finally, after Seven has sort of laid down the law with Janeway to say, it's my life, you don't get to tell me what my moral code is anymore. I don't answer to you. And I'm going to do things my own way. And she does. But she and Janeway eventually find some middle ground of understanding. And Janeway finally has to say, look, I'm never going to condone this choice that you've made to ally yourself with the Rangers. And Seven says, I don't need you to condone my decisions. I just need you to trust me. And that's when Janeway is able to, sort of see the light and let it go. And she says, always, I trust you individually. And that sort of heals the disagreement between them. And because of this, they go from where at the beginning of the story, Seven calls her Admiral, to at the end, Janeway telling her, call me Catherine. This is the point at which, according to the coming of age tale paradigm, the Bildungsroman, known as a Bildungsroman, essentially the main character achieves independence, maturity, and is now on an equal footing with the previous parent figure. Now that they are on a first name basis, this implies an equality in their relationship that did not exist before. Seven is no longer in a subordinate surrogate child relationship to Janeway. She and Janeway are now equals. They are now both adults operating with agency in the universe.
Now, as the story begins, Seven is telling the story to a woman she meets at a bar.
Mm-hmm.
How, because this is Seven telling the story, is there inherent bias in what's being told and how it's being told because it's Seven's perspective of the story?
You're asking if Seven is an unreliable narrator?
No, that's what I'm asking, yes.
I don't think so. I think Seven is, by her nature, a very reliable narrator. I think she tends to err on the side of truth. I think she tends to be self-critical in an honest way. She doesn't tend to embellish. It's not her nature. And I think that, obviously we choose this as a framing device, and we can assume that the variation of the tale or the version of the tale she tells the woman she meets at the bar on Fenris is not word for word the story that I'm telling you in the intervening chapters. She's probably telling a more colloquial, sort of, conversational version of it that favors her perspective on events and her understanding of what happened in terms of scenes that she wasn't in. We can assume her approach to telling the story is a little more conversational and less detailed. But I don't think that I would call Seven an unreliable narrator. She's never shown a propensity to be an unreliable narrator. A little confused, maybe lacking some details at first when we first meet her in Voyager when she's still trying to recover her memory. But once she reintegrates a lot of the lost memories from her childhood, through the course of the last 4 seasons of Voyager. After that, she shows no sign of being unreliable.
So another aspect, to use a quote that you have in the book from Janeway. Janeway, as kind of we mentioned earlier, refers to Starfleet as a racist, reactionary decision born of fear that her not allowing the Seven into Starfleet. How does that impact Janeway's belief in Starfleet itself? Because there's definitely some doubts of her position as an admiral, not only issues of trust, but the purpose of Starfleet. How does that impact her now having that experience with Seven?
I think that Janeway is probably feeling a bit of frustration more than anything. She's feeling frustrated with Starfleet. She's feeling frustrated with the Federation government. She knows from experience they are capable of making better, more enlightened decisions in this. They have in the past, but she also sees what has changed. The recent altercations with the Borg, nearly having Earth destroyed and blown away, has caused them to have a very reactionary stance on this issue when dealing with this particular subject. But at the same time, watching those consequences blow back upon Seven, someone she cares about deeply, makes her very angry to the point where she's willing to stand and fight. This is Mama Bear being pushed into a corner and coming out swinging with claws out. You don't mess with her baby, you don't mess with her cub, and that's what they're doing, and it's pissing her off. So that's really where she's coming from at this point. But I think if you look at sort of a similar sort of mirroring take on that from Seven's point of view, when Seven's love interest, Ellery Cade, is asking her, why are you defending these people who have screwed you over? And Seven has to say, look, I know that they're capable of better because the crew of Voyager showed me they are.
Yeah.
This is what I know the people of the Federation can be. This is what I know Starfleet can be. This is what I know the Federation government can be, even if they're not there now. That's why I believe that in the long run, the better side of their nature is going to win out.
Yeah.
It's just going to take time. And I think Janeway probably is of a similar opinion, but is just sort of in that very immediate moment is just dealing with the anger of the moment. So I think that they're both feeling that frustration. They're both feeling a great deal of disappointment in something that, especially Janeway. Seven was always going to be a little suspicious. She was always going to take things with a grain of salt. Janeway had really high hopes. This is an organization she believes in. And then to come home and be so just bitterly disappointed in how they treat Seven and how they allow themselves to be manipulated by base fear, populist reaction, that's got to be disillusioning for Janeway. That's the sort of thing that when you really want to believe the best of something and it lets you down, that hurts.
Now, you're discuss Seven's part of the story as being a coming of age story. Is there a certain coming of age for Janeway as she loses a little of the naivete of what Starfleet is or could be?
No, not really. I mean, there's always going to be. I mean, that's more of an adult disillusion moment in an institution that you believed in, but that doesn't really constitute a coming of age tale. In a coming of age tale, there's really just the one key protagonist who is going on that journey, and in this tale, it's Seven. For Seven, this is a classic coming of age tale. She, has to deal with the fact that she had her childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood all stolen from her by the Borg. She is dealing with the fact she is in a culture that doesn't want her, that rejects her, that is hostile to her. She has to figure out who she is in terms of her relationship to society, her relationship to her friends, and even her expectations of herself. Who is she? What is she like? What is she attracted to? What does she want? What are her dreams? What are her goals? And how is she going to get there? These are all questions that she's asking herself. And the only way she's going to find the answer is to go on a journey, to leave this sort of last island of safe space that Janeway has sort of carved out for her, where she sort of exists slightly under, still slightly under the umbrella of Janeway's protection. She has to basically step out of that safe space. She has to leave it behind and just go. And this is the classic coming of age tale structure where the the young protagonist. And while while Seven at this point physically is 32, she might as well be 17 or younger, in that she has no life experience, no socialization experience really as an adult. And on top of everything else, she's dealing with probably the fact that only now, as an independent adult going out alone into the galaxy, is she beginning to identify and those parts of herself and realize that she's queer. And this is something she hadn't figured out before. It never came up on Voyager. It was alluded to, but maybe in terms of the allegory of being the outsider, being an allegory for queerness, and the dead naming being an allegory for trans identity. But it never really came up. But now she has to deal with it because we know by the time of Picard, that's canonical. She is queer. That's established. So she's going through that transition. She's trying to figure out independence. She's trying to figure out how to navigate her way in the world. This is a woman who, is in a culture she's never experienced, a place she's never been. She's got to figure out how to travel place to place and do so with relative anonymity. She's got to figure out how to get a job when she's never had to get a job before. She's got to find a place to live when she never had to find a place to live before. She's trying to figure out how to make friends as an adult when she has no idea how to socialize. As it said, in one chapter, watching people flirt in this particular bar is like watching other people speak a language she has never been taught. She can't, and she's trying to pick it up from context, and she can't. She can only get so much of it. So she's sort of flailing about, looking for acceptance, looking for connection, looking for meaning, trying to find herself and trying to find her place in the world, and doing it, in any way she can. And this is really what the story is about. And then eventually, what she finds is a newfound family when she finally encounters the Fenris Rangers. And this is something that human beings tend to do, consciously or unconsciously. We either recreate the family unit that we liked as having as children, or if we didn't like the family unit we had as children, we specifically seek out its opposite. In this case, Seven, who did like the family unit she found on Voyager, winds up replicating it to a degree. Instead of a surrogate mother, she now has a surrogate father figure in Ranger Keon Harper, who takes her in, acts as her sponsor, brings her into the organization, serves as her training officer. He's very much a surrogate father figure in the way that Janeway was a surrogate mother. And then everybody else around her, all the other fellow Rangers, are like the surrogate siblings that she had in her Voyager shipmates. So she builds this newfound family, and suddenly she's got a place where she belongs. Unlike the Federation, the Fenris Rangers are this weird motley bunch of people who just happen to serve together. They'll take anybody who signs up because they need everybody they can get. Nobody gives her grief for having implants. They don't care where she's from, at least not the rank and file until they find out later. But by that point, she's already won them over. So she's got a place where she can start over without baggage, without the burden of a reputation, without people necessarily making assumptions about her because they don't know anything about her. She's this unknown figure who just comes in out of the cold with Keon Harper and steps out of his ship one day, and suddenly it's like, hey, we got a new recruit. Okay, she seems interesting. Let's figure this out. And she blends right in. She basically finds her place. And she knows it. Once she finds her place, she knows it. And that's what changes for her. She realizes that what she wanted at the beginning of the story, place in Federation, place in Starfleet, is not actually what she needed. What she needed was to feel accepted. She needed to feel loved. She needed to feel safe. She needed to feel like she belonged and was welcome. And that's something she wasn't going to find in the Federation or Starfleet. It's what she has found with the Fenris Rangers. So she didn't find what she wanted. She found what she needed. And that's just classic storytelling 101. But again, also a very important element of the coming of age story, learning to differentiate between what you wanted as a child and what you need as an adult. And then completing that transformation is, again, the moment when she's able to sort of cut the line to Janeway near the end of the story. The symbolism, for instance, of after she recuperates in the sick bay after the rescue, and Janeway offers to replicate some new clothes for her, and Seven chooses to put back on the half-shredded, bloody clothes she was wearing when she was rescued. She's rejecting the offer from her former surrogate mother figure to, you know, put on the garments that she wants for her. She's saying, no, I think I'll keep the tattered, bloody identity I've built for myself.
Hmm.
That's the symbolism of that moment. You're like, no, this is mine and I'm taking it back and this is how I'm going to be. So that's really, where the foundation of the coming of age story lies here. It's really all just about Seven making this journey and becoming who she wants to be.
Now, I'm going to read a quote from the text, if you don't mind. It's a little lengthy, so just bear with me. But I really like the quote. So the novelist states, empathy bloomed inside her, her psychic barriers collapsed, and her emotional defense mechanisms unraveled. Her soul stood unguarded before a horror without measure. Strange, overpowering emotions crashed upon her shores and left her shaken and trembling. Which is a wonderful line and a wonderful idea of how she's approaching further her humanity. How is the Seven we meet later in Picard forged from this tragedy in this way?
Well, I mean, this is really the moment where what we've seen of Seven before this time is her grappling with and sometimes not always fully getting in touch with her sense of human empathy, her ability to empathize with the pain and points of view of other beings was not very good when she was first emancipated from the collective. This was not a skill that she particularly was good at, but she began to develop it slowly, little by little. It was still not fully developed by the time Voyager was over. She still was very much a person trapped inside her own head. What she lacked is something that psychologists might call theory of mind, the ability to project oneself into the point of view of somebody else that you're dealing with and say, what does this situation look like to them?
Mm.
How does this feel to them? And this is something that she hasn't really developed up to that point, but she's been working on it. She's trying to get there. Her time in isolation and her struggle to make real emotional connections with people has definitely helped her down this road. But the passage you read, the breakthrough moment for her, tragically comes at like one of the worst, most vulnerable moments you can imagine. She's visiting the scene of a war crime, a mass grave, this multiple kilometers long gully that's been left with the bodies of roughly 80,000 murdered colonists who have been killed by the book's main villain. And all that's left are blanched skeletons, baked in the sun, greasy ash, which is now all over her hands, as a metaphor for blood on her hands. This forces her to confront her own lingering guilt about, things she was used by the collective to do. The fact that as a Borg drone, she was the last thing that thousands of sentient beings saw before their individuality was stripped away and they were enslaved. And she's feeling all of a sudden the guilt for that. She's seeing the evil in it. She's beginning to realize the magnitude of the evils that she has been used to commit, that she was used as a tool by the Borg. And then she's also empathizing with the magnitude of the evil in front of her, of what was done to all these people. And suddenly, the moment she's able to make the connection in her head, my life is no different than the life of this one in front of me. Suddenly, she realizes that's true for the 10,
Mm.
the 100, the 1,000, the 80,000 in the gully. When she hears there's dozens more sighted, she realizes there's millions of these victims across multiple star systems. And it hits her. That moment when you realize your life is worth no more and no less than all these millions who have been killed. And you realize any one of them could have been you, and that every single one of them represents a person as complex as you who's been wiped out, had everything taken away from them by some genocidal lunatic.
Mm.
This is the breakthrough moment. Essentially, she's visiting a site that was inspired by a real life war crime during the Holocaust. Basically, it was the murders at Babi Yar, which is a ravine outside Kiev in the Ukraine. And that's where the Nazis, the Einsatzgruppen, over the course of about 3 days, murdered roughly 60,000 Jews and gypsies and other undesirables from around the Kiev area and left their bodies in the Babi Yar ravine. and I'll spare you some of the more gruesome details, but it was horrific executions of unarmed, women, children, infants, people just left to die and rot out in the sun, and only a few survivors who managed to get out of there by basically letting themselves be buried under the bodies of the dead until nightfall, and then at night they managed to crawl away and escape. One of the most horrific things in the world. It's almost impossible to read the survivor accounts of what a horror it was and not have it just rip out your soul.
Hmm.
And so I thought, this would be the kind of moment where, Seven, at this incredibly fragile moment in her life, this is the moment that finally breaks down the barriers to empathy. This is the moment that finally gets through to her because it taps into her guilt. It taps into that lingering fear of, am I actually just a monster? Am I as bad as what they say I am? All the people who called me a monster, what if they're right? That's a nagging fear that's been lying in the back of her head ever since she was emancipated. They deal with that a couple of times on Voyager, but it's never fully put to rest. So that's continuing to nag at her here. And then when you come to this, that's what it is. It's the combination of both the empathy hit, realizing she can now suddenly understand the sense of loss, the scope of the loss in front of her, but then also connected to her own guilt. How many lives did I destroy? Is this what I am? And that's the breakthrough. And the moment it shatters her, it's just fortunate that Ellery Cade is right there to bring her back from the edge as she's hyperventilating. So that's the beginning of where the real bond begins for them.
Well, like I said, another character you mentioned that's very interesting is Harper, one of the Fenris Rangers, and basically her mentor within the Fenris Rangers. There are several times in the book where Seven has a plan, and he basically tells her, in reality, that's not going to work the way you think it is. I mean, it may work initially, but the blowback is going to be pretty damn bad. However, even though he does warn her, he does back her up when she finally decides this is what we're going to do.
Yeah.
So what does that suggest with Harper, that he trusts her to that degree that even though he feels she's wrong, or not necessarily wrong, but it's going to end badly, he's still willing to follow up and back her play, as it were?
Well, it even says, at one point when she asks him, she says, if you were so convinced this was going to fail, why did you go along with it? And he says, at one point, because you gave me hope. He's a cynic. He's learned, to see all the ways things can go wrong, and in a way, he's let it paralyze him. He lets him get off the hook to not do anything, to say, well, it's just going to go wrong anyway. Why bother? Seven isn't there yet. She still has the righteous fire. She's still willing to go into the breach and say, screw it, let's try to do the right thing anyway. And she's so passionate about it that on some level, he's hoping he's wrong and that she's right. She makes him want to be wrong. So even though his cynicism is telling him, we're going to regret this, something about the fact that she is so unwilling to preemptively accept defeat makes him think, but maybe she's right. Maybe we do still have to fight anyway. Maybe even if it's going to blow back in your face, that's still not an excuse to sit on your hands and do nothing. And it's because she brings the righteous fury, of a social warrior. I mean, this is someone who sees injustice, who sees the weak being oppressed, and just she can't accept it. She has to fight. She has to go in and do something about it. She can't just accept that is the way the universe works. She's not prepared to just surrender to that. And up to a certain point, he had, and then suddenly he's got her, and she actually is so crazy that she kind of makes him believe, well, maybe we can. Maybe we could win. Maybe we could win this thing. Well, no. But the point is that even if you're not going to win, that doesn't absolve you of the need to fight evil. You still have to fight.
Now, another interesting character as the villain, I'm probably going to pronounce the name wrong, General Kogish.
Kogish.
Kogish. So, okay, so I'm right. He's very interesting because, for the most part, he's obviously definitely a villain. And the name of the sector is Curis.
Kiris.
And this is once again a sector that's been abandoned by the Starfleet Federation because of the issue going on Romulus. He suggests that he can bring order to the sector if he could get this new, I guess it was like a battleship and take control.
Solarian battleship, yeah.
Right. How much of that is just bullshit that he's saying, or how much, and that he's just saying because that's a good argument to make for doing what he does, and how much of it does he believe somewhere back of his head that if I do ever get this power, I actually can make things somehow better, so it's worth all the crap I'm going to do to people.
Well, it's not that he even thinks about it being better. It's that once he establishes order with himself at the top of the pecking order, that he can get rich.
Hmm.
There's nothing really noble in his motives. The whole notion that with enough power, I can bring peace, I can stabilize the region, that is self-justifying bullshit that I think most warlords and would-be dictators and autocrats maybe like to tell themselves, if they've got even a hint of a conscience left, they tell themselves that so that they can believe there's something noble in all of the evil shit that they do. All the lives that they take, and they say, well, that was necessary in order to quell dissent and maintain control and order so that we can achieve the grand objective. It's like, yeah, no, you killed millions of people, dude. There's nothing noble about what you're doing here. That was not the way to do it. He's basically blowing sunshine up his own ass at that point. And to a lesser extent, to his subordinates, it's the same thing. And it's possible that he's been brainwashed into this by Errol Tazgul, also known as Ardani, Aristu Mardani, the rogue. Hold on, I got it. Somebody at the door. I got to go. Just delivered. Box full of author copies. Finally got them. They usually show up a little sooner than this, but better late than never. Ooh, this is a beauty.
Perfect timing.
Look at that.
Awesome.
Yeah. Oh, hardcover. That's a beautiful thing.
Mm.
Oh, yeah. Where it says Firewall, that's raised type. So you can sort of feel it. It's like a little bit embossed right there. Oh, Picard is embossed. Nice. I want to see how the maps turned out up front. So I made these star maps for it. Oh, they look good, but they did something weird. What the heck did they do? Well, these were basically not supposed to be printed side by side like this, but that's what they did. It's very strange. It's not the way I would have done it.
How was it supposed to
be? But it's not up to me. Nobody asked me.
How was it supposed to be set up?
They should have been each on a right-hand facing page, so that this one should have been here, and then this one should have been on the page after it. Because one is a wide area view, and the other is a close-up view, like a zoom in on the Kira sector. But here, by putting them together like this, they make it look like one big map, but it's not. This is going to confuse people. I don't know. Oh, well. Unfortunate.
Can I think?
They're still very pretty.
They're actually fantastic copies, though. It's a great cover.
It looks very, very nice. Hey, look. Nice photo on the inside.
Very nice. That's awesome.
Anyway, so I forget what I was talking about.
We're diving into
Kogish, yeah,
and Mardani.
Yeah, Aristu Mardani, yeah, the rogue operative from Federation Security Agency. He probably, to some degree or other, fed all this self-aggrandizing crap to Kogish in the course of sort of recruiting him into this effort. Because obviously he wants to set this guy up as a warlord, and then he wants to sell him tons of crap like weapons, munitions, power cells, stuff for your ships, small arms. So nobody's got pure motives there, and Kogish is basically just another in a long line of people who tell themselves what they want to hear so that they don't have to accept the fact that they are villainous scum.
Does it help Kogish to justify what he does? The fact that he knows better than a lot of people that the Federation isn't the ideal that they're trying to say they are, because he knows they abandoned the sector for Romulus. He knows that there's people within the Starfleet that are working with him to on black market to what he does. He does know that the Federation is not the ideal. Does that help him justify the behavior of himself in that sector?
I don't think he's thought about it that deeply. I think what he is at his heart is an opportunist. What he saw, he used to be, I mean, according to the narrative, he was the guy who ran the defenses for a particular planet, Soroya. He was in charge of the planetary militia that was supposed to protect the planet from outside threats. The Federation pulls out its Federation supplied resources. The NGOs that are sourced out of the Federation, they withdraw because they're all shifting their aim, shifting their efforts over into the Romulan Star Empire to help Romulus and begin that evacuation process. The moment this happens, the whole Kiris sector loses its entire infrastructure upon which it depends. Now you would think, well, if you're in charge of the defense of Soroya, this would be your time. You'd step up defense of the planet. Well, no, he is an opportunist. This has had nothing to do about with saying, oh well, obviously the Federation is flawed and this is a ideological statement. No, he's an opportunist. Everybody pulled out. The Watchmen left, and he took that as an opportunity to overthrow the civilian government, put the planet under martial law, and start selling off its resources and killing anybody who got in his way. The only thing that was stopping this guy from basically becoming a berserker was the fact that he had the Federation and he had Starfleet ships watching over his shoulder. The moment nobody was watching anymore, the moment he was off the leash, this guy went berserk. Now, this is not a principled ideological statement about the Federation. This is a statement about him being a greedy, evil, murderous asshole.
Well, I think you did a great job. I think it's also interesting, like I said, to explore the Federation and Starfleet. This is a great moment, and for some reason I forgot the name of the Vulcan when Seven's begging for help.
Captain Stovak, I believe.
Stovak, and he begging for help, and Stovak is like, "No, it's not really our job to handle this. You're not following the right protocol. This is not the right situation." Once again, it's how much disillusionment can Seven deal with and still later become first officer that we see in Picard.
Well, I mean, obviously, you got to keep in mind this is 20 years before all that. Actually, even more than that. Picard season 3, when she becomes first officer under Captain Liam Shaw. At that point, we're no longer even in 2399. At that point, we're into like 2403, maybe even later. So you got to keep in mind that this is not just 20. This is like 23, 24 years later. And my story is taking place back in 2381. So we're talking about a difference of 20 some odd years. A lot could happen to a person to change their worldview in 20 years. And a lot of what has happened with Seven in the intervening years is she gets disillusioned. She makes a terrible, terrible personal mistake in just like a momentary verbal slip that puts a target on the back of Icheb, who she loves like a son. Icheb is murdered. She spends years hunting down the responsible party and then finally takes her vengeance. And then, much like Inigo Montoya, finds out that after you've been in the revenge business for that long, once it's done, really, what else are you qualified to do? At that point, you're either the Dread Pirate Roberts or the captain of the Enterprise.
Yeah.
So she apparently chooses captain of the Enterprise. But what's also happened is that Starfleet had to go through its own journey through night while she was doing that. While she was on her dark journey of revenge for Icheb, Starfleet and the Federation had to go through its long dark night of the soul as it realizes belatedly, well, we screwed up. The whole reaction to Mars, where we banned synthetic intelligence, artificial intelligence, AI, etc., that was a mistake. That was racist. That was dumb. It was a bad call. And we really just shot ourselves in the foot with that. And we went isolationist. We made ourselves vulnerable to infiltration, to manipulation, psyops. We basically played into the hands of our enemies by listening to all of our own worst elements. And Starfleet has to go through a reckoning. It's made some bad calls, and it pays a steep price for it. But on the other side, when it finally comes out the other side, hopefully they've learned enough to say, okay, let's not repeat the mistakes of the last 15 years. Let's look at this as an aberration where we screwed up. let's change our policies, let's change our approach. Suddenly we were willing to give Seven a space. Let's put her in the captain's chair. Maybe for all we know, they'll say, let's welcome back synthetic artificial intelligence. Maybe we'll see a new Soong type android, in a future Star Trek series set in the 25th century. Maybe there is still time for Starfleet and the Federation to course correct, to own their mistakes and say, let's do better. And I think that the choice to put Seven in command of the Enterprise at the end of Picard season 3 is symbolic of that first step of saying, we need to do better. Let's begin here.
I think there's a lot of fans, such as myself, that would love to know what happens next after that. After Picard season 3. What is next for you? For us, your next novel, is it Star Trek? Is it something else?
I have no idea what my next novel is going to be. I'm not currently under contract to write any novels at this time. I would love to write a Star Trek Strange New World novel, but those are kind of booked up at the moment, pardon the pun. I have an idea for an original novel that I'm tinkering with, but it is not yet developed enough for my agent to take it out to the market. So I need to keep working on it and get it into shape that she can actually get out there and sell it. I need to give her something good enough that she can sell. That's on me. So I don't have any novels in the pipeline, unfortunately. What I do have in the pipeline over the next year or so is a number of pieces of short fiction. 4 of them are Star Trek. They'll be published by Star Trek Explorer magazine, starting in, I believe, the beginning of April and going through the end of the year, issues 11, 12, 13, and 14. Some of them may be print editions. Some of them may be in the magazine's digital supplement. I don't know which ones will be which. I don't know which stories will be print and which stories will be digital, except for the 1 in 11. I know the issue 11 I'll be in print. And that's a TNG Stargazer era story called Dignified Transfer. Put simply, it's a story about Jean-Luc Picard performing what in the military is known as escort duty, as he brings home the body of his best friend Jack Crusher to Jack's widow Beverly and their son Wesley. And that story was particularly meaningful to me because I ended up writing it and having to dedicate it to the memory of my wife's father, who passed away last year. And he was a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Air Force. He at one point had been a Pentagon officer, and he'd had a very big military funeral. And if you've never actually, I mean, it's one thing to see a military funeral on film or on TV and like a story. It's a whole other thing to live a military funeral where you are the family whose loved one is gone, whose loved one was the honored military officer. It's a very different experience to be in it than it is to see it from outside. So that story, with the blessing of the magazine's editor, is going to be dedicated in print to the memory of my late father-in-law. And then in issues 12, 13, and 14, there'll be some cool stories. One will be called Memoriam, another will be called Family History, and the last one will be called Freeblade. They each touch into different eras of Star Trek history. And then I have a couple of original short stories coming out in anthologies. One anthology is called Combat Monsters. The premise is real battles and engagements of World War II, but with monsters, supernatural creatures, etc., of some kind folded into the narrative. And I wrote a story called Boxcar, and that's spelled Bockscar, which is the name of the aircraft that dropped the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. So I wrote a story specifically about them, and I modeled its crew on the actual air crew, the real men who crewed that aircraft that day, and crafted a story about that. And the other original story I have coming out on, I believe it's November 5th, Election Day, is the release day for an anthology from Baen Books called Last Train to Kepler 283c. It's a collection of space Western fiction. And the short description of that, of my story, which is called Living by the Sword, is a young girl who dreams of adventure meets an old female gunfighter who tries to urge her toward a better destiny. But it's got science fictional elements added to that. And so that's what I got in the pipeline. Also, I've got an essay about the professional side of writing media tie-ins for Star Trek. It's going to be part of a collection of academic essays being published by McFarland Books in April. Coming out, I believe, April 28th, I believe, is the release date. And so my article in that is called, Official But Not Canon, The Tie-In Writer's Dilemma. And it essentially digs into, from a professional writing standpoint, what is the difference between something being canon, something being official, something being good, and whether something is in continuity. Because these four things are not synonymous. Each of them is a different thing, and they are not the same thing. Continuity is not canon. Canon is not quality. Being official is not a mark of quality or of canonicity, and so on and so forth. And so I get into it, and part of it is discussing, who has the right to say what is canon in this context. Well, it's CBS Studios, and here's why. And I have to go through the history of who owns the copyright and what does that mean, and what has canonicity or lack of it meant for the tie-in books over, say, the last 40 years. So it's a really kind of and I had to source it, and I had to use footnotes and citations and write it like an actual academic. It was a real experience, but that'll be out in April.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
But absolutely. Actually, I'm fascinated by that one a lot.
It's an expensive book to pick up. It's going to be like, it's an academic. It's going to be an academic textbook, so it's going to be like $55 for a paperback. Not cheap, but that's the way it is with textbooks.
So the important question is, when can our listeners get their hold of Firewall?
Your listeners can pick up Firewall starting on, first of all, if they're buying it in person, they can probably get it right now. Bookstores do not have orders to embargo this title. So a lot of independent bookstores and a lot of your local Barnes and Nobles may have already put it on shelves as of now. This is the Friday before the official release date. The official release date is Tuesday, February 27, 2024. That's the date at which, if you've pre-ordered it online, or if you've ordered it in ebook format, it will either be emailed to you on that date, or in theory should be delivered to you on that date from your online retailer. Otherwise, though, again, if you want to pick it up in person, check your local bookstore. They may already have it out there. And so that's what's going on with that. You can get it as of February 27. It's available in hardcover, ebook, and unabridged digital audiobook formats, including both CDs and downloadable digital files. And it's just one of those things you can grab it. And I hope it does really well in its first week, because we are hoping for a big first week on this one. And it makes a lovely gift for the Star Trek fan in your life, especially if they like 7 of 9. Consider giving it as a gift. Buy multiple copies and keep them on hand for whenever you need a surprise gift for a Star Trek fan.
Well, I will say, having the opportunity to read it, it's a great book, and I really enjoyed it. Especially, I thought you did a great job writing 7 of 9. And I want to thank you so much, Mr. Mack, for coming on the show. You've been fantastic.
It's been a pleasure being here. Thank you for having me on.
Right, have a great night, sir.
You too.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the First Stars podcast. Please help me battle the algorithms by liking and subscribing. Be sure to return for the next episode, when Bill Oberst Jr. boards the mothership, discusses upcoming horror films. Until next voyage, travel on.